Imagine the silence, not calm, but the one that comes before the verdict. A dark room. The stone under your feet is cold. The light of the kerosene lamp trembles, and that is enough to understand. You are no longer a person. You are an example. In Victorian England, punishment was not supposed to correct, it was supposed to frighten. Slowly. Publicly. Forever. There were no screams here, only looks, and a law that knew no compassion. This is not a story about executioners. This is a story about a system. Stay. And find out what the price of order was in a world where mercy was considered weakness. The sentence, moments before punishment. Silence does not come suddenly. It descends slowly, like a heavy cloth covering the room layer by layer, until the air becomes thick and every breath is noticeable. There is no shouting in this room. There is no beating here. Here they wait. The stone underfoot is cold, even through the soles of their feet. The walls are dark, eaten away by dampness and time. Somewhere above is the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, which does not illuminate, but only hints at the shape of the space. The light here is not for sight. It is for control. The man stands still. His hands are lowered. His head is slightly tilted. He knows any movement is superfluous. In Victorian England, the first stage of punishment did not begin with pain. It began with awareness. You no longer belong to yourself. Your body is an entry in the register. Your voice is no longer needed. In a few minutes, the door will open, or it won't open, and this expectation is worse than the answer. Because the answer, no matter how cruel it is, still puts an end to it. And here, it is just a comma. Long, protracted. Victorian society believed in order. Order above all. Order as a virtue. Order as a religion. And punishment was its language. Not emotional, not angry, but cold. The judge did not raise his voice. The executioner did not hurry. The spectators did not shout. The whole system was built to show, this is not revenge. This is a procedure. A person was not punished because they hated him. He was punished so that others would watch. And everyone who stood here in this shadow knew. Punishment was not always intended for the one who received it. The man raises his eyes, not with hope, with understanding. He has heard the stories before, about whips, about pillories, about cages where the body remained alive, but the human disappeared. He knows that the sentence can be easy, or maybe slow. And the worst thing about it is not the pain. The worst thing is the unknown form of pain. Because in Victorian England, punishments were rarely quick. The system loved time. Time as a tool. Time as an ally. A few seconds seem like minutes. A few minutes seem like hours. And in this silence, a person begins to hear not external sounds, but his own thoughts. And thoughts are the loudest executioners. Was the crime great? Sometimes no. Sometimes stealing a piece of bread was enough. Sometimes it was to say the wrong word. Sometimes it was simply to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The law was blind, but very attentive. And it didn't ask questions. It only announced. That's why this moment, before the verdict, was the most important. Because there was still the illusion of choice. The illusion that something could be changed. That someone had made a mistake. That now they would say, free. But that didn't happen. The door creaked. The sound was quiet, but in this silence it sounded like a gunshot. This was not the beginning of punishment. This was confirmation that the system had woken up. Public pain, when punishment becomes a spectacle. Punishment did not begin with a blow. It began with a removal. The person was removed slowly, without haste, as if a thing to be shown. Unhurried is the key word. Because in Victorian England, pain was never in a hurry. It had a form, a ritual, a time. The street was already waiting. A wooden pole stood in the middle of the square, dark from rain, hands, and years. It was not decorated. It was not disguised. On the contrary, it was open, visible from afar, part of the cityscape, like a lamppost or a well. It was a pillory, and everyone knew why it was there. The man was brought closer. The crowd was silent. In the Victorian era, public punishments were rarely accompanied by screams. People watched with the same attention with which they watch a fire or an accident, not with sympathy and not with joy, but with the feeling, this could have happened to me. The hands were fixed, the neck too, not tight, not cruel. Enough, because the point was not in strangulation. The point was in immobility. The person became part of the structure, temporarily, like a board or a nail. He was no longer the center of attention. The center was a form of punishment. And then the waiting began. An hour, sometimes two, sometimes longer. The sun moved. A shadow crawled across the cobblestones, and the person stood. The face was tense at first, then empty, then strange, as if torn from the body. The muscles ached, but not like after the blow. It was a slow, aching pain, the kind that has no peak. Children looked up from the bottom. Women walked by. Men didn't hold their gaze longer than they should. Because the pillory worked only when everyone saw it, but no one interfered. For petty theft, for swearing, for drunkenness, for debts. Sometimes for something that simply didn't please the court. But the pillory was only the beginning. There was also the whip. It wasn't shown in advance. It was brought silently. The whip didn't always leave its mark right away. The first blow was sharp, unexpected, but still clean. The second was different. The body began to understand that this was not an accident, that this was a process. The audience didn't count the blows out loud, but they counted them inside, because every blow is a unit of fear that you can take home. Sometimes the punishment wasn't a beating, but a cage, iron, low, placed so that it could be seen from the main road. A person was put inside, locked up, and left. Not for an hour, not for two, but as long as the law allowed, and the weather. Rain, wind, cold. The body froze. People passed by. Some stopped, some glanced. Some were stone, not out of anger, out of habit, because the punishment was part of the city's rhythm, like bells, like a bazaar, like a working day. And the cruelest thing about all this was that the system didn't consider itself cruel. It was rational. The judges talked about order, about discipline, about morality, about example, and each punishment had one main goal: to leave a mark not on the body, but in the memory, so that the person who came out of the cage would no longer belong to himself, and so that those who watched would remember it longer than the bruises. Sometimes the punishment lasted longer than the body could endure, but this was already considered an annoyance, not a mistake, because the law had been fulfilled. In Victorian England, pain was not the goal. It was a tool, and the quieter it worked, the more effective it was considered. But there were punishments that did not require a whip, a pole, or a cage. Punishments where the body remained intact, but the person did not. We will talk about them later, because the most terrible thing in this story is not what was done to the bodies, but what was done to those who survived. The unseen, when women and children were punished. The most terrible thing about the Victorian penal system was not what it did to those whom everyone saw, but what it allowed to be done to those whom it was inconvenient to look at. Women were not taken out in the same way as men, and children too. They were not put in the center of the square. They were removed from sight. Because a society that considered itself moral did not like to see its own cruelty in small bodies and broken voices. But the law saw everyone the same. A woman was punished not only for a crime, she was punished for violating her role, for drunkenness, for swearing, for disobeying her husband, for poverty that looked too loud. There were special punishments, not for the body, but for humiliation. She could be tied not to a pillar, but to a chair of shame, seated, fixed, left, so that she could not fall, and could not run away, and could not cover her face. The crowd watched and was silent, because a woman who violated the order was considered not a victim, but a warning. But even more terrible was what awaited the children. A child in Victorian England was not a symbol of innocence. She was a small adult who had not yet had time to be completely broken. And the law did not wait. For stealing food, for begging, for vagrancy, for being homeless, a child could be placed next to adults, or separately, in the same cage, on the same cold floor. The difference was only in the scale of the body, not in the severity of the sentence. In the workhouses where the children were sent, the punishment did not look like violence. It looked like a regime. Early rising, cold, silence. The same movements, the same mistakes, and the same consequences. The body quickly learned to obey, and the mind to fear silence, because silence meant that you were being watched. The children worked, slowly, mechanically, without questions, and if someone cried, it was considered not suffering, but disobedience. They were not beaten often. It was not necessary. The system learned to be more efficient. It learned to deprive attention, not to look, not to answer, not to call by name. The child ceased to be a person. He became an individual, by record, by replaceable labor. Women and children rarely made it into the annals of history. They were not written about in the same detail. They were not kept in portraits, and that is why their punishments were the most effective, because they left no trace that could be easily seen. Victorian England believed that discipline builds character, that fear educates, that pain is just a side effect of order. But when those who cannot defend themselves are punished, order ceases to be a virtue. It becomes an excuse. And this is where the system shows its true colors. No crowd, no show, no applause. Just the rule, and the body that must obey it. A punishment that worked from within. For if the body can be broken by pain, the will can only be broken by silence. Silence as punishment. Victorian England's most effective punishment left no bruises. It didn't require a whip. It didn't require a crowd. And it almost never caused outrage, because it looked humane. It was silence. The person wasn't beaten. They were simply taken away. The door closed. The bolt was put in place. And the world narrowed to a few stone walls. The solitary confinement cell was not a dungeon in the classical sense. It didn't immediately scare. On the contrary, it looked orderly, clean, almost calm. A small window high in the ceiling, a little light, a little air, just enough to live, and not enough to be human. The Victorian system believed that silence was cleansing, that loneliness leads to repentance, that isolation is the path to correction. This was called reform. There was no clock in the cell. There were no voices. There were no footsteps, only the echoes of one's own movements. At first, the person listened. She waited. Maybe someone would speak. Maybe someone would open the door. Maybe this was a mistake. But nothing happened. After a while, the brain began to do what it always does when it is left without the outside world. It created sound. A drop of water seemed like footsteps. The rustle of fabric was a whisper. Breathing was the presence of someone else. Silence was not emptiness. It was pressure. Days lost their shape. Nights merged with mornings. The light in the window became the only marker of time, and even that betrayed it. Food was served in silence, without looking into the eyes, without words. A person was not called by name. A name was considered superfluous, because a name is a personality, and the system worked only when personality was erased. In some prisons, the rule of absolute silence was in effect even outside the cells. Prisoners were led out into the corridors with their heads down. Faces were covered. Glances were forbidden. Not to see. Not to speak. Not to hear. This was not punishment in the classical sense. This was reprogramming. People stopped thinking in words because words died out without an interlocutor. Thoughts became fragmentary, incoherent, dangerous. Some began to talk to stones, some with shadows, some with themselves, but as if there was someone else in the room, and this was considered progress. Silence supposedly showed the true nature of a person. So wrote the reformers. So said the officials. But the truth was simpler. Silence broke faster than a whip and left no evidence. The person left the cell intact. His hands were in place. His back was without scars. But his gaze no longer sought other people. He slid past. His voice became quiet, uncertain, as if asking for permission to exist. Some left silent forever. Some broke. Some never left again. And the system again called it correction. Because the result had been achieved, man no longer created problems. He no longer took up space. In Victorian England, they believed that order was silence, that an ideal society was a society without noise. But noise was life, and silence, brought to an absolute, was a slow disappearance. And the most terrible thing about this type of punishment was that it did not look cruel. It could be defended, explained, justified, because no one saw blood. But it was here, in these cells, that the Victorian system reached its perfection. It learned to punish in such a way that the victim could not prove that he was being punished at all. Returning broken. After the fix. The door opened without ceremony, without words, without eye contact. The person was simply told to go. No speech, no apology, no explanation of what exactly had been fixed. The world beyond the threshold looked the same as before. The same streets, the same houses, the same faces. But the person who went outside no longer belonged to this world completely. The first steps were the hardest, not because of the weakness of the body, because of the excess of space. After the camera, any open space seemed a threat. Noise, aggression, voices, intrusion. People talked too fast. They moved too close. They lived too loudly. The one who returned after the correction didn't know how to look people in the face right away. His gaze would slide down, to the side, creeping. Because in silence, he was taught, a look is a risk. It was hard to find a job, not because of laziness, because of a mark that is not visible but felt by everyone. The former prisoner didn't have to explain anything. Everything had already been decided for him. He wasn't trusted with tools. He wasn't left alone with money. He didn't listen for long, because the system didn't just punish. It redefined a person. Now he was the one who was there, and that was enough. Some returned to their families, but even there they found silence, a different, colder one. The children looked warily. The wives spoke cautiously. The men were brief. Because a person who is silent for too long begins to scare, especially in a world where silence is a sign of punishment. Some tried to live as before, to work, to pay, to be invisible. But inside, something remained unfinished. The body knew how to stand still. The arms to fold themselves. The breath to slow down without an order. Even without walls, the cell remained nearby. At night, dreams returned silence. Without images, without words. Only a feeling, as if the world had narrowed again. Sometimes people woke up with relief because at least in their dreams, the rules were clear. Some returned voluntarily. Yes, they returned. Not because they wanted to, but because it was easier behind the walls. There was no need to decide there. There was no need to choose. There was no need to speak. The system called it relapse, but in reality, it was a desire for a familiar form of pain. Because after the correction, freedom demanded too much. There were those who couldn't stand it. They disappeared from the streets, from documents, from memory, without scandals, without stories, without obituaries. And society took it calmly, because order was maintained. In Victorian England, they didn't ask whether a person had become better. They asked whether he or she had stopped being a nuisance. And if so, the goal was considered achieved. No one counted broken voices. No one measured destroyed wills. No one recorded how many people had lost the ability to be themselves, because that wasn't in the reports. The punishment ended on paper, but in reality, it continued for a lifetime. And that is why the Victorian system was considered successful. It worked for a long time, quietly, effectively. It did not require constant presence. People carried it inside themselves. Architects of order. Those who designed silence. A system does not appear by itself. It does not arise from random decisions. It is written. Punishments in Victorian England were not the result of the cruelty of individuals. They were the result of a carefully constructed logic, a logic that was considered reasonable, progressive, necessary. Behind every closed door stood not executioners, but reformers, people in clean suits, with neat handwriting, with the conviction that the world could be fixed if it was properly ordered. They did not shout, they did not threaten, they explained. In offices far from the cells, texts were written about morality, discipline, and the benefits of silence. They talked about crime as a disease, about the criminal as a patient, about isolation as a cure. The words were soft. The forms were clear. This was how the idea was born. If a person were separated from the noise of the world, they would hear their own conscience. It seemed logical, and that was why it was dangerous. The judges did not see bodies. They saw categories. Not a man, a criminal. Not a woman, an immoral person. Not a child, a future threat to order. Categories are easier to organize. They are easier to move around in tables. They are more convenient to correct. And when the system works with categories, it no longer requires sympathy. In the courtrooms, the verdicts sounded calmly, without emotion, without explanation, because explanations were considered unnecessary. The law was sufficient. The reformers loved statistics. They counted the decline in crime. They reported on the order. They wrote reports. There was no room in these reports for broken views, for people who returned silent, for those who could no longer live outside the rules hammered in, because it was not in the numbers. The ideology of order had one main feature. It never considered itself cruel. It considered itself necessary. If a person disappeared, it means the system worked. If he is silent, it means he is corrected. If he returned, it means he is ready to obey again. That is how the architects of order thought. They did not see silence as punishment. They saw it as a tool for purification. But silence does not purify. It erases. And when this became obvious, the system did not stop. It adjusted the wording. It changed the names. It clarified the rules. Because to admit a mistake would mean admitting that order could be unjust. And Victorian England could not afford that. Punishments became correction. Isolation became reform. Fear became discipline. And the people who wrote these words sincerely believed they were doing good. That was the real danger. Not in whips, not in cages, but in the belief that the human soul could be rebuilt like a street or a building. The architects of order thought in spaces, cells, corridors, halls. They believed that the right form creates the right behavior, but they failed to take into account one thing. Man is not space. It cannot be designed without cracks. And when cracks appeared, they were simply ignored. Because a system that works does not listen to those it breaks. When order became normal. The greatest victory of the Victorian system was not that it learned to punish, but that it taught society to get used to it. Punishments were no longer surprising. They ceased to arouse fear, and later, even curiosity. They became the background, like the chime of a clock, like the smoke of factories, like dark clothes on the streets. People no longer asked why someone was being led. They only noted how it happened. Was it fast? Was it quiet? Was it without unnecessary noise? Because order that works needs no explanation. Children grew up observing discipline as part of everyday life. They saw adults lower their voices, how they looked away, how they stopped when an order was given. And they learned early, not because they were beaten, but because they saw the consequences. Punishments shaped not only the behavior of the offenders, they shaped the expectations of everyone else. The expectation of silence, the expectation of obedience, the expectation that everyone knew their place. Society gradually reorganized around this logic. Workplaces became tougher. Schools became stricter. Families became more reserved. Emotions began to be seen as risks. Anger was unwanted. Sadness was weakness. Loud laughter was inappropriate. And if someone crossed the line, it was perceived not as pain, but as a disturbance. People began to punish themselves. They straightened their backs. They suppressed their voices. They held back their tears. Because internal discipline was more effective than any camera. Thus, order penetrated homes, into schools, into churches, into workrooms. It no longer looked like coercion. It looked like the norm of politeness. Those who kept quiet were considered serious. Those who obeyed were reliable. Those who did not ask questions were safe. And those who did not fit in began to seem dangerous even without committing a crime. This was the main transformation. Punishments ceased to be an event. They became a language, the language with which society spoke to each of its members. Be quiet, and nothing will happen to you. And the majority obeyed, not out of fear, out of habit. Habit is the strongest form of control, because a person who is used to it does not feel the shackles. It considers them part of the clothes. And when those who asked appeared, why so? Society looked at them with suspicion, because the order that became the norm is not afraid of chaos. It is afraid of questions. Thus, Victorian England created an environment where the majority lived correctly, but not necessarily freely, where the rules were clear, but not always fair, where punishment was no longer frightening because it was everywhere. And that is why this system survived the era itself. Because when order becomes the norm, it ceases to need whips and cells. It lives in gestures, in looks, in the silence between words. And even when the old prisons were closed and the old laws were rewritten, something remained. Not as a rule, but as a feeling. The feeling that it is better not to stand out, not to say too much, not to be too noticeable. This was the true legacy of the Victorian order. Not a punishment, but the habit of living as if punishment was always possible. The echo today. A silent echo that still works. Silence is not just the absence of sound. In Victorian England, it was a tool. Precise, cold, calculated. And the scariest thing is that it has not disappeared. It simply has ceased to look like punishment. When we say the past, we imagine something complete. Old cells, wet stone, bars, kerosene lamps. We imagine that all this remained there in the 19th century, along with whips, pillories, and sentences read in a calm voice. But history does not like completion. It loves transformation. And if you listen carefully, the echoes of the Victorian order can still be heard today. Not in words, not in laws, not in headlines, but in the small movements that we make automatically, in the pause before saying something, in the decision to remain silent, in the inner feeling, it is better not to touch. This is not the verdict of modernity. This is just an observation. And here, as a producer of $1 million historical channel, I will tell you honestly, it is these moments that hold the viewer. Because we do not just talk about cameras. We make the listener think. What if the system remained inside habits? Silence does not always come with an order. Sometimes it comes as self-preservation. In Victorian times, people were afraid of something concrete. A pillar, a whip, a cage, a judge. They knew where the threat came from. They could imagine it. Today, a threat rarely has a form. It more often looks like a shadow. And a shadow is the most convenient tool of control. Because a shadow cannot be grabbed. It cannot be questioned. Once upon a time, punishment was an event. Today, punishment more often looks like an absence. No response. No support. No doors that should have opened. And this is important. We are not saying that the world has become worse. We are saying that the world has become more complex. It has learned to punish not with a blow, but with silence. Not physically, but socially. Not publicly, but imperceptibly. In Victorian England, a person could be removed from the square, locked behind a door, isolated, made invisible. It was official, legal, written in the books. Today, the mechanism may be different, but the feeling is similar. When you are not heard, you disappear. And here begins the echo. Not loud, almost shy. It manifests itself when a person begins to correct even before someone accuses him. He changes his tone, smooths out the corners, rewrites the message 3 times, deletes a phrase that seems too direct, leaves a smiley face instead of a position, chooses silence, because silence is safer. This is not weakness. This is a survival skill, and it is very old. Because the Victorian era taught people one thing. The main thing is to be comfortable. The main thing is not to stand out. The main thing is not to create problems. And when a society lives with such logic for a long time, it becomes not a law, but a character. Now the important point. Many people think that punishment is always something obvious, but the most effective punishments are those that can be called the norm. Those that do not cause protest because they look like common sense. In Victorian England, correction was a beautiful word. Isolation was called moral purification. Silence was called treatment. Fear was discipline. Words changed the shape of pain. They made it acceptable. And if we want to look honestly at the present, we need to ask ourselves, what words today make control invisible? Etiquette, professionalism, adequacy, normality. Don't overdo it. Keep it simple. These words are not bad in themselves. They can mean respect. They can mean balance. But sometimes they sound like a soft lock that clicks without a sound. And then a person does what prisoners did after solitary confinement. She lowers her voice. She looks carefully into each other's eyes. She checks herself for compliance. Not because she wants to, but because she doesn't want to be punished. In Victorian prisons, silence was the program. They forbade talking. They forbade looking. They were forbidden to be. Today, no one formally forbids, but a ban sometimes works better when it is not announced. When people themselves feel the limit and do not cross it. This feeling of the limit is the echo. And to be honest, the echo is felt not only in society. It is felt in us too, when we listen to these stories before going to bed. Why do such topics enter the bedtime format? Because silence, discipline, control are not just stories. They are emotions familiar to the body. The body remembers what it feels like to sit quietly so that there are no problems. Not speak out so as not to call out. Muffle oneself so that everything is normal. This is not politics. This is psychology. This is a cultural legacy. And that's why, when we talk about Victorian cells, we feel not only the cold of stone, we feel our own experience of silence. And this is where I, as a producer, do another important thing. I don't give the listener an easy way out. I don't say, well, it was terrible then, and now it's good. Because such morality relieves tension. And our style is tension without screaming. It's an invisible threat. It's a hook. So listen carefully. The Victorian penal system shaped the world not only through prisons. It shaped the world through the idea that a person should be controlled, even if they don't commit a crime. Order became a moral value, and freedom was a risk. And when this becomes the norm, society begins to suspect not criminals, but those who are too loud, those who are too emotional, those who are too frank. They may not do anything to you, but they will make you feel you don't fit in. And that feeling is sometimes stronger than any whip. In Victorian England, after a person was corrected, he came back broken. He didn't scream. He didn't complain. He simply became different. Today, brokenness may look different. Not dramatic, not theatrical. It's just that one becomes more cautious, less direct, less alive. And when someone asks, "What's wrong with you?" one answers, "It's fine." This is modern silence. Sometimes we confuse it with calmness, but calmness is a choice. Silence as punishment is a habit. And now we come to the moment that leads us to the next chapters. Because if echo exists, then it has a source. Not abstract, not philosophical, very concrete. Rules that make behavior predictable. Rules that reward convenience and punish deviation. Rules that promise security in exchange for a bit of freedom. And here comes the main question that we will ask next. What happened when control learned to live without prison walls? Because in the 19th century, punishments took the form of a cell. And today, the form can be different. It can be invisible. It can be daily. And this does not mean that we have turned back. It means that history does not follow a straight line. It moves in waves. And in this wave, if you look closely, you can see a familiar silhouette. Order, which looks like a blessing, and silence, which sounds like correctness. But there is one detail. In Victorian England, people knew what they were afraid of. They knew what they were running from. They knew what exactly could happen to them. Today, it is often more difficult. We simply feel tension. We cannot always explain why, and we call it fatigue, overload, stress. Perhaps this is the modern form of the same mechanism, a world that forces a person to control himself every minute. And if so, then this story is not about distant England. It is about us. But calmly. We will not draw conclusions now, because our story is not yet finished. This is only Chapter 8, The Bridge. the shadow on the threshold. Discipline without walls. When the walls disappear, control does not weaken. It simply learns to disguise itself. Victorian England spent decades understanding one simple truth. A person does not have to be locked up if he has learned to lock himself up. And when this idea became obvious, the system took a step forward. It began to go beyond prisons. Control no longer needed cells. It needed rules of conduct. Unwritten, understandable, such as are not discussed. That is when discipline ceased to be the exception and became the background. It did not look like coercion. It looked like correctness, like politeness, like a sign of maturity. And that was more dangerous than any lock. People were no longer punished for every infraction. They were taught to foresee the consequences. They were taught to read space, guess where the line is, and most importantly, don't cross it. This was control without orders. In factories, you didn't have to shout. The master's gaze was enough. In schools, you didn't have to hit. The teacher's silence was enough. In families, you didn't have to explain. A pause was enough. A pause is always a signal. Victorian society gradually learned to communicate in this way, not through direct prohibitions, but through a sense of wrongness. A person began to doubt himself even before someone stopped him, and it was very effective. As a producer, I will say, this is where most viewers start to move in their chairs, because it's familiar. Not historically, physically. We all know that feeling when nothing seems to have happened, but you already understand that you did something wrong, and you can't always explain what exactly. Control without walls works through expectations. Expectation of the right tone, the right reaction, the right distance. It does not need a law. It lives in culture. In Victorian England, this control was especially strong in public space. People learned to behave as if they were always being watched, even when no one was around, because someone could appear. And this feeling of the constant possibility of a look changed behavior. People kept their backs straighter. They spoke more quietly. They did not allow themselves too much. Not because they were afraid of a specific punishment, but because a mistake became shame. Shame is a very convenient tool. It does not require strength. It works from the inside. And shame itself became the new form of a wall. A person was not locked up. They were made an example of. Not spectacularly as before, but quietly. They lost trust. They lost opportunities. She lost her voice. And everyone saw it, and everyone drew conclusions. Thus, discipline penetrated society without provoking resistance, because resistance always looked like a violation of order. And to violate order meant taking a risk. Gradually, people began to guard the boundaries themselves, not only for themselves, but also for others. They corrected. They hissed. They advised to be more careful. Don't push yourself. Think about it. And this was considered care. This is where the system reached true maturity, when control began to be supported by those it controlled. Victorian England did not invent it from scratch, but it was she who made it part of everyday life. part of a culture that looked reasonable, restrained, civilized. And that is why this form of control survived the era itself. It is not set in stone. It does not need keys. It travels easily through time. When we talk about discipline today, we often mean self-control. The ability to control ourselves, to be collected, not to react emotionally. And there's nothing wrong with that, up to a point. But history shows that when self-control becomes a duty rather than a choice, it ceases to be freedom. The Victorian system understood this well. It didn't want people to be happy. It wanted them to be predictable. Predictability is the foundation of order. A person who always behaves the same way doesn't cause problems. A person who knows their limits doesn't need supervision. A person who is afraid of looking wrong doesn't ask questions. And here we come to an important turning point. Control without walls is not about the past. It's about a mechanism that can be transferred, adapt, update. The good citizen, the model product of order. The system does not consider its work complete until it has created a model. Not an enemy, not a criminal, but an ideal citizen. Victorian England had long sought this form. It experimented with whips, cameras, silence, discipline. But real success came when the type of person appeared who no longer needed to be punished, because he was already doing everything right. The model citizen did not challenge the order. He did not need supervision. He himself became its continuation. He did not need to be stopped. He stopped himself. He knew when to be silent, when not to look, when not to ask questions. And most importantly, he considered it his own choice. As a producer, I will emphasize the key point here. This is the moment when the viewer usually thinks that the story is about to end. They say, the system worked, and that's it. But in fact, this is where the story gets complicated, because the model citizen is not a character from the past. It is a construction that lives longer than any era. The Victorian ideal of obedience was simple. A person had to be hardworking, reserved, silent in public, emotionally controlled, predictable. Not too poor, but not too noticeable. Not too loud, not too lively. And this was considered a virtue. Schools educated people like this. Work rewarded this. Society approved of these people. And those who fit in received the main reward, the absence of problems. The absence of problems looked like freedom, but in reality it was a form of agreement. You don't get in the way, and they don't touch you. That doesn't sound cruel. That sounds reasonable. And that's why it worked. The model citizen didn't need prison. The prison lived in him. It showed in his posture, in his tone of voice, in the words he chose, and in the ones he never said. He could sympathize, but not too deeply. He could be indignant, but quietly. He could have an opinion, but cautiously, because to be too harsh meant going beyond the limits, and limits, as we already know, were everywhere. In Victorian society, such people were considered the foundation of stability. The state relied on them. The economy relied on them. They didn't make a fuss. They didn't demand change. They didn't question the logic of order. And that was ideal. But any system that creates an ideal automatically creates deviations, those who don't fit in. And here's the important point. Deviation no longer looked like a crime. It looked like strangeness, inconvenience, excessive emotionality, unpredictability. Thus, a new form of danger appeared, not a criminal, but an inconvenient person. An exemplary citizen looked at such people with caution, not with anger, not with hatred, but with quiet condemnation, because he knew being different is risky. And the system encouraged this reaction. It didn't need denunciations. Social distancing was enough. A look, silence, exclusion. And people learned quickly. They corrected themselves before they became uncomfortable. They removed the sharpness. They reduced ambitions. They extinguished emotions because they wanted to remain exemplary. So the ideal of obedience began to live a life of its own. It no longer needed reformers or judges. It was transmitted through upbringing, work, everyday rules. It became a cultural norm. And that is why it survived Victorian England. Today, we rarely use this word, obedience. It seems outdated. But we often talk about compliance, about adequacy, about the ability to keep oneself in check. And there is nothing wrong with that, as long as it is a choice. But history shows, when an ideal becomes a duty, freedom becomes conditional. An exemplary citizen does not feel imprisoned. He feels right. And this is what makes him so valuable to the system, because he does not fight, does not protest, does not destroy. It maintains order simply by existing. And here we come to the next step, because when there are enough exemplary citizens, the system no longer needs control from above. Control begins between people, when silence is chosen. The highest form of control is not fear, and not even punishment. The highest form of control comes when a person no longer needs to be forced, when he himself chooses silence. In Victorian England, this moment did not come suddenly. It was the result of decades of discipline, rules, and habits. The system worked on the body for a long time, and then switched to the will. And when the will learned to obey, everything else became superfluous. Silence ceased to be coercion. It became a rational decision. People began to be silent not because they were afraid of the whip, but because it was easier, safer, more convenient, less risky. And this is where control becomes almost invisible, because coercion always provokes resistance, and choice does not. A person who chooses silence does not feel like a victim. He feels responsible. He believes that this is right, that this is more mature, that this is more civilized. And the system encourages it. It rewards restraint. It praises calmness. It supports predictability. Victorian culture made silence a sign of respect. Emotions are something to be kept under control. Excessive frankness is weakness. And these ideas have not disappeared with the era. They simply stopped looking like rules. When silence becomes a choice, it ceases to seem dangerous. It looks like maturity, like self-discipline, like the ability to keep yourself in check. But this is where the trap arises, because a choice that seems free can be the result of a long learning process. Learning where every step in the direction caused discomfort, judgment, a feeling of wrongness. And over time, a person stops taking these steps, not because they can't, but because they don't want the consequences. In Victorian society, it looked like this. People didn't speak out publicly, not because it was forbidden, but because it could put them in an awkward position. They could lose their jobs, their reputations, their trust. and that was enough. Silence worked as insurance. It's better to remain silent than to explain. It's better not to stand out than to make excuses. It's better to be invisible than to be wrong. And so internal censorship appeared. Not rude, not strict, but careful. It didn't say, "You can't." It asked, "Should you?" And most people answered, "You shouldn't." As a producer, I will say something important here. This is the moment when the viewer usually begins to feel discomfort, not from the story, but from recognition. Because this logic is not familiar from textbooks. It is familiar from life. We all know what it is like to be silent so as not to complicate, to give up an idea so as not to argue, to smooth out words so as not to appear difficult. And there is no evil intention in this. There is only a desire for peace. But history shows peace built on silence has a price. Because when silence is kept long enough, silence becomes the norm. And then speaking begins to look like a violation. In Victorian England, a person who spoke too loudly attracted attention, and attention always meant risk. Therefore, it was better not to attract. Today the mechanism is different, but the logic is familiar. Being too direct is dangerous. Being too emotional is uncomfortable. Being too lively is risky. And silence again seems like the right choice. This is where the system achieves what it dreamed of. A person no longer needs control. He controls himself. He becomes the guardian of his own boundaries, and even more so, the guardian of the boundaries of others. Because when someone breaks the silence, it starts to annoy. Not because it is wrong, but because it breaks the usual order. And here we come to the most delicate moment. When silence becomes the choice of the majority, the noise of the minority begins to look like a threat. Not a crime, not a danger, but a disturbance of the peace. And society reacts. Not with a whip, not with a law, but with exclusion. With silence in response. Exclusion. Lack of support. This is the mildest form of punishment, and one of the most effective, because it does not provoke protest. It seems like a natural reaction. In Victorian England, this mechanism allowed the system to exist without constant violence. Today, it allows many systems to function without apparent coercion. And that is why history is not over yet. Because if silence can be a choice, then the question arises, but is this choice always truly free? We will leave this question open, because the answer to it cannot be given by a historian, and not even by a producer. Each listener finds it for himself. The silence that remains. Stories usually end with an event, a sentence, change, disaster, or release. But this story is not like that. It does not end with the fall of a system. It does not end with reform. And it does not give a sense of relief. It simply subsides. Victorian England is long gone. Its streets have changed their appearance. Its prisons have become museums. Its laws have been rewritten dozens of times. But something remains, not in stone, not in documents, but in the pauses between words. We have come a long way, from the whip to silence, from the cage to habit, from punishment to self-control. And at each stage, the system has become less and less visible, more and more polite, more and more rational, until it finally disappeared from sight. And that's when it became the strongest. Because what is not seen is not resisted. People no longer ask why they are silent. They ask whether it is appropriate to speak. And that is a very subtle difference. In Victorian England, order was loud. It jingled keys. It creaked doors. It read sentences aloud. Today, order is silent. It doesn't need a voice. It works through expectations. The expectation that you will be intelligent, discreet, convenient. And most people do become that way. Not out of fear, out of habit. Habit is the last stage of any system. When there is no more need to be explained, when the rules are not discussed, when the boundaries are invisible, but everyone knows where they are. And here the story stops. Not because there is nothing more to say, but because the personal begins next. Because each listener hears something different in this silence. Some peace, some fatigue, some tension that is difficult to explain. History does not demand an answer. It does not ask for a conclusion. It only leaves space for feeling. Perhaps the real question is not whether the Victorian order was cruel, but how easily any order becomes a part of ourselves.
And how difficult it is then to distinguish where the system ends and one's own choice begins.
We are used to thinking that freedom is loudness, but sometimes freedom is the right to speak and the right to remain silent. The only difference is whether you have a choice. This story does not give an answer. It only reminds us that silence also has a history. And if it seems normal today, that doesn't mean it's empty. It's filled with the past, habits, decisions, systems that once thought they were right. And now that we've reached the end, there's only one thing left to do. To sit in this silence for a little longer, without words, without haste. Because sometimes it's in moments like these that a story resonates most clearly. If this story left a feeling in you, if you listened to it slowly, in the dark or half asleep, and it didn't disappear right after the last words, support the channel with a like and a subscription. It helps these quiet stories to continue to resonate. You can also leave a short comment, even one character. Algorithms love noise, but you and I know the value of silence. Good night, and until the next story.